The studio was silent except for the hum of the tape machine. Jackson Browne sat alone in the control room, headphones around his neck, staring at the reels spinning in front of him. It was 3 a.m. The engineer had gone home hours ago. Outside, Los Angeles was asleep. Inside, something was ending. He had been listening to the album for the 6th time that night. 13 songs. 2 years of work. Every note placed with the kind of care that comes from believing you're making something that matters. The mixes were clean. The performances were strong. The melodies were there. Everything was exactly as he had imagined it. And that was the problem. He leaned forward and pressed stop. The reel slowed, then stopped. The room fell into a heavier silence. He sat back in the chair and closed his eyes. His hands were shaking, but not from exhaustion. It was something deeper. A feeling he couldn't name, but had been growing for weeks. A voice in his chest that kept saying the same thing over and over. This isn't real. He didn't know when it started. Maybe it was during the final vocal sessions when he realized he was singing words he had written a year ago, words that no longer reflected what he felt. Maybe it was during the string overdubs, when the arranger asked him what emotion he wanted to convey and he couldn't answer. Maybe it was the night his producer told him the album was finished and he felt nothing. The label was waiting, the tour was booked, the press was scheduled, pre-orders had already started. His manager had called it his best work. Critics who had heard early mixes said it would define his career. Everyone believed in it, everyone except him. He stood up and walked over to the master tapes. They were labeled by hand, dated, organized. 2 years of his life reduced to 7 reels of magnetic tape. He picked one up and held it in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. He turned it over slowly, feeling the weight of it, the solidity. It was real in a way the music on it wasn't. He had written these songs during one of the hardest periods of his life. A relationship had ended badly, the kind of ending where both people say things they can't take back. A close friend had died suddenly, leaving questions that would never be answered. He had spent months alone in a rented house by the ocean, trying to make sense of grief and confusion and the feeling that nothing was certain anymore. The songs came from that place. They were raw, unfinished, desperate. But when he brought them into the studio, something changed. The producers wanted structure. The label wanted radio singles. The band wanted parts they could play with confidence. So he polished, he refined, he softened the edges. He made the songs sound like what people expected from him. And with every decision, the songs moved further away from the truth they were supposed to carry. Now, listening back, he could hear the distance. The vocals were controlled when they should have trembled. The arrangements were tasteful when they should have been chaotic. The lyrics, which had once felt like confessions, now sounded like observations. He had taken something fragile and made it durable. He had taken something honest and made it professional, and in doing so, he had lost it. He put the reel back down and looked at the stack. 13 songs, months of recording, thousands of dollars. Contracts signed, expectations set. He knew what releasing this album would mean. It would be successful. It would sell. People would listen to it and call it beautiful. Critics would praise his craftsmanship. It would be everything he had worked toward. But every time someone heard it, they would be hearing a lie. Not a lie in the words, not a lie in the melodies, but a lie in the feeling, a lie in the distance between what he had felt when he wrote the songs and what they had become in the studio. And that distance, he realized, was the one thing he couldn't live with. He sat back down and stared at the console. The buttons and faders glowed softly in the dim light. He thought about calling his manager. He thought about calling the label. He thought about all the people who had invested time and money and belief into this album. He thought about the band members who had played on it, the engineers who had mixed it, the designers who had already started working on the cover. He thought about what it would mean to walk away. The phone was right there. He could pick it up. He could tell them it was done. He could let it go. In 6 months, the album would be in stores. In a year, he'd be on stage playing these songs every night. In 5 years, people would talk about it as a turning point in his career. He could have all of that, or he could destroy it. The idea had been growing in his mind for weeks, but he had pushed it away every time it surfaced. It felt extreme, irrational, wasteful. But now, sitting alone in the studio at 3 in the morning, it didn't feel extreme. It felt like the only honest thing left to do. He stood up and walked over to the tape machine. He ejected the reel and held it in his hands again. It was just tape. Thin strips of magnetized plastic wound around a spool. Fragile, really. Easy to damage. Easy to erase. He set it down gently and walked out of the control room, through the hallway, and out into the parking lot. The air was cool. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. A few cars passed on the street below. He stood there for a long time, looking at nothing, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. When he went back inside, his mind was clear. He didn't call anyone. He didn't explain. He simply took the master tapes one by one and erased them. Not quickly, not in anger. Slowly, methodically, track by track. He sat at the console and watched the meters as the music disappeared. The drums first, then the bass, then the guitars, then the strings, then his voice. He worked through the night. Each song took time. He would play a section, listen to it one last time, then erase it. Some part of him needed to witness it, to be present for the ending, to make sure this wasn't a decision made in haste or confusion, but something deliberate and necessary. By the time the sun came up, the album was gone. He made 3 copies before he erased the masters, not because he wanted to keep them, not because he thought he might change his mind, but because some part of him needed proof that it had existed, that he had done the work, that the choice he was making was real. He put the 3 copies in a cardboard box and took them home. He didn't label them. He didn't tell anyone they existed. He put the box in a closet behind old equipment and tried to forget about it. The phone calls started 2 days later. His manager was the first. He sounded confused at first, asking if there had been some kind of accident at the studio, then concerned, asking if Jackson was okay, then angry when he realized what had actually happened. The label called next. Then the band. Then the engineer. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Everyone wanted to understand. He didn't have an explanation that made sense to anyone but himself. He tried to say it wasn't finished. He tried to say it wasn't ready. He tried to say he needed more time. But none of those things were true, and everyone knew it. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. The album was finished. It was ready. It was good. But it wasn't honest, and he couldn't put something into the world that he didn't believe in, no matter how much it cost him. The conversations were difficult. His manager tried reasoning with him first, then pleading, then ultimatums. The label executives were colder. They talked about contracts and obligations and consequences. They reminded him of the money already spent, the promotional schedule already set, the expectations already created. They said he was being selfish. They said he was being irresponsible. They said he was throwing away his career. And maybe they were right. But every time he tried to imagine going through with the release, he felt something worse than guilt. He felt the slow erosion of his own integrity. And he knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that if he let that album go out into the world, he would spend the rest of his life running from it. The label threatened to sue. His manager quit, not out of anger but exhaustion. He said he couldn't represent someone he didn't understand anymore. Some of the musicians stopped speaking to him. The press ran stories about creative breakdowns and self-sabotage. People who had been excited about the album felt betrayed. People who had invested in it felt abandoned. He understood their anger. He didn't blame them. He had made a choice that affected more than just himself. He had broken promises. He had wasted resources. He had let people down. But every time doubt crept in, he would remember that night in the studio. The feeling of listening to something that sounded right, but felt wrong. The distance between the songs as he had written them and the songs as they had become. And he knew, even in the middle of the consequences, that he had made the only choice he could live with. So he lived with those consequences. The months that followed were hard. Professionally, He was in limbo. The label refused to work with him until he delivered something new, but they also wouldn't release him from his contract. His reputation took a hit. People in the industry whispered that he had lost his nerve, that he couldn't handle the pressure, that he was unreliable. Tour opportunities dried up. Collaborators became cautious. Friends asked him gently if he was okay. He told them he was, and in a strange way he meant it, because something else happened too, something quieter. He started writing again, not for an album, not for a deadline, not for anyone but himself. He wrote because he needed to, because the act of writing, without the pressure to make it perfect or commercial or safe, felt like breathing again. The songs that came were different, simpler, more direct, less polished. He didn't try to make them sound like anything. He just let them exist as they were. Fragile, unfinished, true. He would sit in his living room with his guitar, working through melodies and lyrics without worrying about structure or radio play or what anyone would think. Sometimes a song would come together in an afternoon. Sometimes he would work on the same verse for weeks. It didn't matter. There was no deadline, no expectations. Just him and the music and the slow rebuilding of trust between the two. He didn't know if anyone would ever hear these songs. He didn't know if they were good, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was making something that mattered. He thought about the 3 copies sometimes. They were still in the closet, untouched. He had never listened to them after that night in the studio. Part of him wanted to. Part of him wanted to know if he had made a mistake. If the album was really as hollow as he remembered. If he had destroyed something valuable out of fear or pride or some other weakness he couldn't see. But he never opened the box, because the copies weren't the point. The album wasn't the point. The point was the choice itself. The moment when he had to decide what mattered more, success or honesty, approval or integrity, the version of himself the world wanted or the version he could live with. And he had chosen. Slowly things began to shift. He recorded a few new songs, stripped-down versions that felt closer to the truth he was looking for. A small label took a chance on him. The album he eventually released was quieter than anything he had done before. It didn't sell as well as the destroyed album probably would have. Critics were divided. Some called it brave, some called it boring. But the people who connected with it really connected. He started getting letters from listeners who said the songs had helped them through difficult times, who said they heard something real in the music, who said it felt like he was speaking directly to them. Those letters meant more to him than any chart position ever could. Years passed. He kept making music. Some albums did well, some didn't. But all of them in one way or another carried the lesson of that lost one. He learned to trust his instincts more, to care less about expectation, to remember that the only audience that truly mattered was the one inside himself, the one that knew when something was true and when it wasn't. People still asked him about the destroyed album. Journalists would bring it up in interviews, treating it like some great mystery. Fans would speculate online about what it sounded like. Collectors would search for bootlegs that didn't exist. The lost album became a legend, a story people told about artistic perfection or creative madness or the price of authenticity. But for him, it was never a mystery. It was just a moment when he looked at something he had made and realized it wasn't true, and he loved music too much to lie. He thought about the 3 copies one more time, years after he had put them away. He was older then, more settled. His hair had gone gray. His hands weren't as fast on the guitar. He had made other albums, played thousands of shows, lived through more endings and beginnings than he could count. He was cleaning out his house one afternoon, going through old boxes, deciding what to keep and what to let go. He found the box in the back of the closet. It was dusty. The cardboard had softened with age. He pulled it out and set it on the floor. For a long moment he just looked at it. He thought about opening it, listening to the songs, seeing if time had changed his perspective, seeing if he had been too hard on himself, seeing if the album was really as empty as he remembered. His hand reached toward the box, then stopped. Because some things aren't meant to be revisited. Some choices, once made, have to be honored. Not because they were right, not because they were easy, but because they were necessary. The album was gone. The music was erased. Only 3 copies remained, locked away untouched. And that was how it was supposed to be. He pushed the box back into the closet and closed the door. That evening he sat alone in his living room, guitar in his lap, playing a melody that had no name. The room was quiet. The light was fading. The world outside moved on the way it always does, and somewhere in a closet, in a box, 3 reels of tape sat in the dark, holding a version of himself he had chosen not to be. He played the melody again, slower this time, letting the notes hang in the air. It wasn't finished. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was just true. And that, he had learned, was enough. He thought about all the years between that night in the studio and this quiet evening, all the music he had made, all the stages he had stood on, all the people who had heard his songs and felt something. And he knew without doubt that none of it would have been possible if he had released that album. Because that album would have been a crack in the foundation, a compromise he couldn't take back, and every song after it would have been built on that compromise would have carried the weight of that first dishonesty. By destroying it, he had saved everything that came after. The guitar strings hummed softly as he played. The melody was simple, just a few chords repeating, but it was honest. It was real. It was him. And somewhere he knew there were people listening to his music right now. In cars, in bedrooms, in moments of quiet or pain or joy, they were hearing something that connected to their own lives, something that felt true. That was the only thing that mattered. He played the melody one more time, then set the guitar down gently. The room settled into silence. Outside, the evening deepened into night, and in the closet the 3 copies remained, untouched and unnecessary. Because the real album, the one that mattered, was the one he never made. The one he had the courage to destroy. The one that taught him the most important lesson of his life, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from something everyone else wants you to finish. That sometimes the most important work is the work no one ever hears. That sometimes the only way to stay true is to let go. He sat in the quiet room, feeling the weight of that lesson settle around him like an old coat. It was a hard lesson, an expensive one. But it was his, and he wouldn't trade it for anything.